You should have a printout. I don't know if there's any more back there. Anybody not have our printout on the book Leviticus? I told Scott as I was going out the door last week, I had brought or left my sheet that I made all my notes on. If you could see my notes, you'd see that I make a lot of notes on my sheet, and I had left them at home. And so I was struggling a little bit last week, and I will struggle again tonight, I'm sure, as we begin our lesson again and review just a little bit. And that's what I wanted to do. The first 5 chapters of Leviticus, it is talking about offerings. And the reason for these offerings had a purpose. Ralph and I were talking just a little bit about it. He says, well, I've read through it. Said about 4 times, he said, still don't know if I know everything. Well, that's me, and I'm trying to teach it. So I don't know how well I know this, and that's why sometimes I rely on you to help produce some information for me. But with that being said, I'm going to tell you everything I know, and that's not going to be a lot. So when we look at the first 5 chapters that we actually covered, now I'm going to review chapters 1, 2, and 3 last week. So I want to review that if possible. So the way this is laid out, it is laid out in and I did an outline, and that's the kind of way I like to do it, Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, and all that. And so I laid that out that way and got some input from that, did a little studying, and so I changed some of it up as I went. But let's look at Roman numeral 1. Worship revolves around the 5 offerings. So we're talking about worship. And the first 3, we're talking about the sacrifices. Number 1, the burnt offerings. And I'm going to review here a little bit with you. I'm not going to read all the verses. I'm going to review a little bit with you. Because if you get to looking at burnt offerings, and I'm going to do a little comparison when we get on down a little bit. Burnt offerings, if you're not very familiar with it, sounds a little bit like a sin offering. Well, what's the difference? I'll try to explain the best I can. So these laws concerning worship, 1 through 5. The thing that I noticed, the Hebrew word, when we look at burnt offering, was olah. And I found that out as I was reading through that, which means up in smoke, that which goes up. Because when you look at the burnt offering, the whole animal was slaughtered. It was put on the fire. It was burned completely, all except one thing. Who can tell me what that was? The hide. The hide was saved, and that was the priest part. And the hides, if you read through, and we remember about the building of the tabernacle and a lot of those things, and they lived in tent. They were tent dwellers. I'm sure the hides were used in a lot of cases either for clothing or for different purposes of life itself. So that was probably a very important item to have. But with that being said, the worshiper, if you remember, is the main person because they're there to show something to God. The priests are there to help with that, so to speak. The worshiper, the one that's making the sacrifice, is bringing the animal in. They bring it into the compound by the altar. And this is where this takes place. I can't say this is where all of them takes place, but this is where this one takes place for the most part. Now, I'll show the difference in that. So, before you do that, and this is something we need to remember, I want us to refer back to Genesis chapter 8 and verse 20. And Noah built an altar unto the Lord and took every clean beast. Now notice there it says every clean beast. Well, what does that mean? Well, in the Bible it talks about clean and unclean animals, and we'll be getting into that a little bit more. I've touched on it a little bit, but it says clean beast and every clean fowl, and offered a burnt offering unto the altar. So this was not, what we're talking about Leviticus wasn't anything new. God had already, and not just in this place, but you can see where burnt offerings were offered way before we get to Leviticus unto this part. Look, if you would, again, if you would, Genesis 22 in verse 1 and 2. And I'm going to read that one real quick. Genesis 22, verse 1, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abram and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here am I. Verse 22, verse 2 of chapter 22, and he said, Take now thy son, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of the Moriah, there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains. Now, we know the story there. He was going to offer up his own son as a burnt offering. So, what was the burnt offering? Again, it was something that was offered by his own free will. It was not mandated at this time. It was offered on his own free will, and that's brought out here many times. And it also, if you remember making the notes there, it was a sweet aroma unto God, because this was something going to God. It was something that the person was offering to God. It was a burnt offering. It was an atonement now, but it was offering, and it wasn't mandated that he or he did that for their family. Okay. But it was a burnt offering. Now that was the burnt offering. So let's skip on over to the second chapter. Well, let me finish up real quick on my notes. If you remember the summary there, it says this is a free will offering, male of the herd, without blemish. All the animals, cows, sheep, doves, pigeons, these was the ones could be offered, would be consumed by fire. That means totally consumed. And the animal to be offered would be depending upon the person's ability. So not everybody could afford a cow or a bull without blemish. Or maybe they couldn't a lamb or a goat, but they could a pigeon or a dove. So that's what they could offer. And again, there were certain ways that the priest had to lay it out there, but it was all consumed with a burnt offering. Okay, any questions so far? Now I've got some more notes here, and I'm not going through all that. Here's what we know. In a burnt offering, blood had to be shed. That was a point made out. But what do we do when we get to the second one? Number 2. This is the laws for the grain offering. Now, blood is not going to be shed here, but it was brought to the altar and burned. A handful was be burned on the altar. The grain was fine flour. That was something that was noted. Now, this fine flour could be offered, and it had to be offered to the priest. They burn it upon that altar. Now, in here, we notice it was adding of something. There was some things that was added. What was added? Oil, olive oil, was put on this small offering, and also frankincense. Now, this was burned on the offering. Well, what happened to the rest of it? The rest, given to the priest for their part, was to be taken home and used. Now, it could have been a cake. Could have been something prepared. Not only could have been fine flour, could have been a cake cooked in an oven, not like an oven we would think of, but some type of oven, like an old oven they did have in those days, which clay. It could be something that was cooked on a griddle, and more like a cracker, as best I can understand. So these are the things that it was offered. Notice here, it had to be unleavened cakes of fine flour, oil, unleavened wafers. None could not have any leaven. As a matter of fact, if you go back and studying, as far as Passover was come, they had to search a house to make sure there was no unleavened or any leaven in the house for this purpose on the Passover. All right, let me move on. I'm going to skip on down verse, and I'm hitting on a few verses to point out some things. It calls this a meat offering, but there's no meat in this. It was called a meat offering. If you go all the way down, Leviticus 2, verse 9, a meat offering and a memorial, calls it a memorial thereof, shall be burned upon the altar. Again, no leaven could be there, but what else could be? Salt could be added to this. And salt is something that represents a preservation. When you compare that to leaven, leaven was decomposing, immediately starts breaking it down. So that's a symbolism, and in my mind, that's what I take it for anyway. One thing that the person was given command not to eat, and that was the blood. Now, the blood was a life-giving source of any animal, and the blood was not to be eaten. Okay, let me do a little quick review or summary on that. I'm on page 7 now, if you want to follow along with me. A lot of this I've already mentioned. The fine flour had to be mixed with frankincense and oil, and a portion of it burned on the altar. The priest would take the handful, put it on there to be consumed. The rest would be taken home for the priest to consume. It wasn't for everybody to have. It was only for the priests and their families to be able to have this. The meal offering was the first fruits to be offered, the ripe fruits. Number 2 there, these first fruits were burned with oil and frankincense, and no blood was used as a sacrifice. It would be burned upon the altar